I'm ahead of the curve and welcome to another video. Today I thought I would do something a bit different. Instead of actually reviewing a book, I would recommend 5 books that I feel that everybody should read. So these 5 books are of different subject matters. There are 2 fiction books in this selection and there are 3 non-fiction books. I felt it was appropriate to make this different kind of video because a lot of people have wanted me to recommend them books that I felt that they should read or my favourite books. And whilst I do have a Goodreads account where you can go and see my favourite books as I've listed them, or at least all of the books that I do read and that I have read, I felt that compiling 5 books that I'd highly recommend everybody to read on my YouTube would be appropriate in that case. With the formalities out of the way, here are 5 books that I think everybody should read. So the first book of today's video is called Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning. So I think what makes this book special for me, and the reason why I think everybody should read it, is the fact that it has not only a cohesive, very easy to read analysis and timeline of what actually happened in these concentration camps, and the horror stories of the Jews being transported in the trains, it has a slightly different perspective on the perpetrators, these Nazi soldiers. It portrays them, as the title suggests, as ordinary men. So it goes over the psychology of these Nazi soldiers in a way that doesn't justify their actions, but more so in an attempt to understand them. And so the main premise of this book is to explain that conformity was a huge thing within the circle of these Nazi soldiers, and that not every soldier was a psychopath. If anything, the soldiers in the concentration camps who were holding these Jews in horrendous conditions, they were not psychopaths necessarily, but they were just conditioned from a young age, or at least brainwashed, to commit such atrocities. And he also, interestingly, points out some kind of myths about the concentration camps themselves. For example, when you would think of a German soldier in the concentration camps, you would probably think that they were a psychopath savage. But in fact, the case is made in this book that a lot of the German soldiers, when they were told to kill Jews or any innocent people during these times, they would tremble behind their weapon. They would be sick. They would struggle to murder innocent people. They would sometimes miss a point-blank shot because they were trembling so harshly. And so Browning doesn't justify the actions of these soldiers, but he attempts to understand the psychology behind their actions and why they actually went through with these horrific actions even though they knew themselves that they were bad. Not only am I a fan of the Nazi Germany subject, but I'm also a fan of an author being fair in their writing and kind of debunking myths and kind of being unique in that aspect of introducing ideas that aren't often given credit for. So number 2 on this list is Dostoyevsky's Crime and Punishment. Now I have mentioned this before in various posts on Instagram and in previous videos, but I must stress how influential this book is when you really start to think about what Dostoyevsky is trying to put across in terms of the ideas, the themes that this book represents. And so the story of this book, to briefly summarize, is Raskolnikov, and I know I butchered that word in Russian, but Raskolnikov, he is basically a very poor man. He's living in the back streets of Russia, St. Petersburg, and he is trying to pay for his tuition fees. His family are in turmoil, and essentially he gets to the point of trying to justify murdering an old woman and taking her money because, for all he's concerned, she is a despicable human being and society around her would probably not be too alarmed by her death. And so this old woman is not a desirable human being, she's not likeable, pretty much, but she has a lot of money. And Raskolnikov makes it his mission to steal her money, but he ends up murdering her instead. And don't worry, I'm not spoiling this story. This happens within a matter of pages, what Raskolnikov finds from murdering this old woman and stealing her money, now even if Raskolnikov convinced himself that he was ready to murder her, he was instead ashamed of the fact that he couldn't cognitively overcome the idea of murdering somebody. Even if there was every reason to murder this old woman, Raskolnikov, he could not comprehend the fact that he just got away with murder, pretty much. But he's actually torturing himself about the murder, even though he consciously had the idea that he would be fine with it. And so this book is a fantastic analysis of the human condition. So, in a sense, it is a psychological thriller, but it's one that isn't kind of a blockbuster hit. It's one of the deepest books I've ever read. And so from seemingly escaping the responsibility of being held up to the consequences of his actions, Raskolnikov finds himself in a psychological conflict of turning himself in or not. And he's also at the same time pursued by particular investigators. So it's a very, very deep, mesmerizing, unforgettable story. And for that reason, it makes into this video as one of the books you really should read. So the third book that I think everybody should read is George Orwell's 1984. Now, this is another book that I have mentioned various times in my Instagram posts and in my previous YouTube videos. I think a lot of people will know this book. A lot of you will. Even a lot of you probably have read it, in fact. But for those who haven't read 1984, it has to be one of the first books that you read when getting into literature or classic literature. So to spell out the plot of this book without spoiling anything, Winston works in a records department. And the world that Orwell has set up in this story is a dystopian one. And essentially, the reason why this book is so famous is because it covers a sublime theme in politics, such as what was seen in the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. One of the main ideas that revolutionized the story in this is the idea of thought crime. And so thought crime is an action of thinking about something that is illegal in a society such as this one, and being imprisoned for thinking against the rules of society that the government have laid out. The government in this case can imprison anyone who thinks against their legislation, their rules. And of course, this is a complete totalitarian, authoritarian state that we're talking about. This is a true dystopian alternate world that we could possibly live in the future, and most definitely have people lived in this in the past. So Winston's aware of this type of reality that he's in, and he starts to reject the rules that the government have forced upon him. And this turns into a story of romance as well, and a thriller. But in some sense, this book is a history book, because as I mentioned, a lot of the themes that Orwell writes about within the book are what has already happened in history, as I said, in Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia. It is fundamental that you read this book if you haven't already. It is a literary masterpiece as far as I'm concerned. So the fourth book I'm going to recommend in this video is Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Now, it is true that I've already done a review of this book on my channel, and I've also discussed it on my page on Instagram before, but I felt that I wouldn't want to miss it out just in case somebody hasn't read it. But nevertheless, I thought I would include it anyway, just in case anyone hasn't seen me raving about it before. So this is a non-fiction book, and essentially this is a book on one of the most famous Stoics, if not the most famous Stoic, Marcus Aurelius, who is a Roman emperor. Now, what I admire about this book in many ways is that Aurelius never intended this book to actually be read by the general public. In fact, this book is comprised of his diary entries, but at the same time it writes so beautifully, and it's so relevant today as well. And so it's essentially a self-help book in many ways, but It is the OG self-help book, I think, is an appropriate way of putting it. I must admit, the lessons to be learned in this book, they are countless. It has to be one of the best philosophy books, as well as one of the most important books for anybody to read. And of course, if you are thinking of reading it from this recommendation, then be sure to check out my review of the book on my channel. So the fifth and the final book I will recommend is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Out of the other books that I've recommended, this book is probably the most rereadable and easy to read. And this is because this book is slightly more than 100 pages in total, and half of the book comprises of Frankl's experience in a concentration camp and his recollections of what happened and his reflections as well, and how he found meaning in a meaningless place as such. And the other half is centered around Frankl's form of psychotherapy, which is called logotherapy. Under the definition of logo is meaning, and so it's a meaning therapy. But again, like Meditations, I would say this is one of the best self-help books, if you want to call it that, because it kind of reminds you of how lucky you are. Because it certainly reminds me of everything that I have and how meaning can be found in the smallest of things possible. For example, Frankl was starving throughout his time in the concentration camp, but nevertheless he found meaning in interacting with other people, or at least striving to survive by eating rations of bread and giving other people happiness, or at least corresponding with the friends that he had that weren't already dead. And so essentially this book is about a man who has lost everything, but what he does have is his friends that he's found in this meaningless place, and he's also got the inkling to survive through this horrific time, to get out of this position, but to also find some kind of resolution in lacking such materialism as we all have these days. All in all, I would say that this book really does teach us to appreciate the small things that we have and to not take things so seriously, and to just appreciate everything that you can whilst you have it. I also think that this is the type of book that is really rereadable to the extent that if you ever forget how lucky you are in comparison to how people were in the past, as soon as you reread this book, you'll really be in shock, and you'll kind of kick yourself for thinking such thoughts, you know. It really has that powerful effect of just reminding you how lucky you are. So that concludes my 5 books that I think that everybody should read. I hope you enjoyed the video, something a bit different. I aim to try and do some more videos that are not book reviews. I'm open to any suggestions, so feel free to comment any suggestions of what I can talk about in future videos regarding philosophy, science, debate, books in general. So be sure to check out the links in my bio to my Goodreads, Instagram and website. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.